Alright, my friends. Yesterday we read our first myth about Prometheus and Pandora. Our characters in Prometheus and Pandora, our two main characters, were Prometheus, who was immortal and created the first humans, and Pandora, who was mortal and opened a box that she was not supposed to open. Remember, when she opened that box, sorrow and pain and death and disease and all of the bad things in the world came spilling out, along with hope. This myth explains how the first mortal creatures were made and how bad things were brought into this world. We're going to read another myth today. The name of our myth today is Demeter and Persephone. Those are going to be our main characters of our film, and we'll take some notes about those characters and what that myth explains when we're finished reading. I want to review what a myth is really quickly first. Is a myth a nonfiction story about something that really happened? No, myths are fictional, which means they're not true stories, or they're about things that didn't really happen, about made-up things. Do myths try to explain things in nature? Yes. Do myths feature just normal characters like you and me? No, myths feature supernatural characters or characters with special abilities. A lot of Greek myths have immortal characters, which means that they live forever and never die. Alright, my friends, as we're reading our story about Demeter and Persephone today, we're going to keep an eye out and see what notes we can take about our characters and what special powers they have. And we're going to see if this myth explains something in nature. We'll see if we can figure out what it explains.
Spirited. Spirited means carried off mysteriously or secretly. CJ couldn't wait to hear the end of his bedtime story to see what happened to the prince who was spirited away in the middle of the night. Pine. To pine means to long for or to desire to have. Although she truly loved summer camp, Grace would often pine for her mother while she was away. Bountifully. Bountifully means in a great amount or bounty, abundantly. Sophia was looking for a 4-leaf clover, and luckily, clovers grew bountifully in her front yard. Despair. Despair means to lose, give up, or to be without hope. During his 4th voyage to the Americas, Columbus began to despair as he sailed near the coasts, looking for gold that wasn't there. Retrieve. Retrieve means to rescue or bring back. Andre left his sweater in the classroom and had to retrieve it before going home. Take a minute and see if you can think of a synonym for the word retrieve. Remember, a synonym is a word that means the same thing. Some synonyms you could have used are recover, rescue, or get back. As we read our myth today, pay close attention to see if this myth helps us explain something in nature or if it teaches a moral lesson. As you have learned, the ancient Greeks believed that there were many gods and goddesses responsible for the workings of the world. There was Poseidon, the god of the sea, Ares, the god of war, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, to name just a few. Demeter was the goddess of the harvest and agriculture, or farming. It was because of her the ancient Greeks believed that fruits hung heavy on the trees, wheat grew in the fields, and vegetables ripened on the ground. Remember, we learned in our last domain that Demeter was the goddess who, at Athena's request, made the olive trees green, plentiful, and strong for the ancient Greeks. Demeter had a daughter named Persephone, who was the joy of her life. Persephone was known by all of the gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus as a beautiful girl, just like her mother. and like her mother, she was full of happiness, warmth, and light. As long as the two of them were together, it was summer year-round. Some days, Demeter would take Persephone with her to tend to the crops in the fields. On these days, Demeter would work among the crops, and Persephone would play in a nearby field of flowers, picking bouquets. One such day, Persephone strayed farther and farther away from her mother, until, humming a little tune, Persephone was far out of Demeter's sight. Now Persephone was not just known by the gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus. Hades, Zeus's brother and the god of the underworld, had also taken notice of her. As god of the underworld, Hades lived underground and oversaw all the souls of the dead. He and his three-headed dog, Cerberus, saw to it that none of the dead escaped back to the land of the living. Hades had fallen in love with Persephone, and the king of the underworld wanted to make her his queen. On that day, as Persephone drifted away from her mother, Hades harnessed his 4 black horses to his golden chariot. As Persephone bent to pick up one last flower, she could hear the faint sounds of hooves beating. Persephone stood up and looked around. As she did, Hades tore open the ground that separated the underworld from the land of the living, and grabbed Persephone. He spirited her away, back to the underworld in his chariot. As the sun began to set, Demeter finally stopped her work in the fields. "Persephone!" she called out, ready to take her daughter home. There was no answer. Thinking that perhaps Persephone had not heard her, she called out again. Demeter heard nothing but the chirps of evening crickets, and then she began to worry. Demeter searched all night, calling for her daughter, but no matter where she looked or how loudly she called, she could not find Persephone. As the night wore on, Demeter began to look older. Wrinkles formed on her face, her body grew crooked, and she moved more and more slowly. By the time the sun came up the next day, Demeter was no longer full of happiness, warmth, and light, but was a bent old woman. In her night of searching, Demeter had not found Persephone, and so she turned to the sun god, Helios, who during the day sees all, and asked for help. "Oh, Helios," Demeter said, "have you seen my daughter Persephone? Do you know where she is gone?" "Hades has taken her down to the underworld to be his queen," Helios replied. Upon hearing this, Demeter began to despair. How was she to ever retrieve her daughter now? Demeter began to weep for her lost daughter, and in her sadness, she forgot to tend to the crops in the fields. The grass turned brown, the wheat stopped growing, and soon there was no more food on earth for the animals and people to eat. Every tree, vine, and field was bare. Even the gods received no more offerings, for the people did not have any food or meat to spare. Humans offered food to the gods and goddesses as gifts to show their appreciation and to keep them happy. After some time, Zeus saw that the people would starve if something was not done. Only gods and goddesses could go to the underworld and then leave, so Zeus traveled to the underworld to persuade Hades to let Persephone go. Persuade is another form of the word persuasion, which we heard in our last read aloud was one of Pandora's gifts. Do you remember what persuade means? Persuade means to convince. "Hades," Zeus said, "if you do not return Persephone to her mother Demeter, nothing will grow on the earth again. The people will starve." Why will nothing grow on earth unless Persephone returns? Right, because Demeter, who is the goddess of the harvest, is sad without Persephone, and so the crops are not growing. "I will gladly return her," Hades said, "if she hasn't eaten anything. You know the rules, Zeus. Whoever eats of the food of the underworld or drinks of its water must stay forever." Zeus and Hades looked at Persephone, waiting for an answer. Had she eaten the food of the underworld? Persephone began to cry. "I ate 6 pomegranate seeds," she said. A pomegranate is a fruit with a reddish rind that has many seeds enclosed in a juicy pulp. What do you think is going to happen in our story now? A rule was a rule, but Zeus knew that if Persephone remained in the underworld, nothing would grow on the earth again. So he made a deal with Hades. For each seed that she has eaten, Persephone will stay 1 month in the underworld as your queen. For the rest of the year, however, she will live on earth with her mother Demeter. How many seeds did Persephone eat? 6. So how many months of the year must she stay in the underworld? 6. There are 12 months in a year, so if she has to stay 6 months in the underworld, how many months of the year will she be able to live with Demeter? You've got it, that's one of our doubles. She will live with Demeter for 6 months. And so it was that for 6 months of the year, Demeter and Persephone were happy together. Fruits, wheat, and other plants sprouted from the ground, and it was spring. As they grew bountifully, the world was bright, and it was summer. During those 6 months that Persephone lived in the underworld, however, Demeter would ignore all the crops on earth and would pine for her daughter. The leaves would fall off the trees in autumn and would be bare in winter, while Demeter longed for her daughter. Once Persephone was returned to Demeter, it would be spring again. In our read aloud today, we heard the following sentence. Demeter would ignore all of the crops on earth and would pine for her daughter. Here, pine means to long for or to desire to have. The picture that shows this definition of the word pine is picture number 1 on top. Pine can also mean something else. Pine also means a tree that has long, thin needles instead of leaves that stay green year-round. We see this in our second picture. I'm going to read a couple of sentences. If the sentence I say uses pine as our first meaning, like missing or longing for something, I want you to hold up a number of 1 finger, number 1 finger. If the sentence I say uses pine as in a tree, I want you to hold up 2 fingers. My sister was pining for an ice cream cone. That would be number 1. There are many pines that make my backyard shady and cool. That one would be 2. Demeter pines for Persephone in the winter. That would be 1. Demeter walked up to a tall pine and leaned against it. That would be 2. Alright, my friends, who are the characters in our story today? Our main characters in our story were Demeter, who is the goddess of the harvest and agriculture, Persephone, Demeter's daughter. We also had Zeus and Hades. Zeus and Hades, remember, are brothers. We also featured we saw a couple of other gods and goddesses in our story today, and we saw Hades' dog, Cerberus, that guards the gates to the underworld. All of our characters today were immortal. They were all gods or goddesses, or immortal characters.
In our story today, Hades spirited Persephone away, or took her away. Why did he do that? You've got it. Hades had fallen in love with Persephone and wanted to make her his queen. How did Demeter feel when she realized that Persephone was missing? Was she pretty worried? How do you know? What clues did the story give us that let us know how Demeter was feeling? What happens when Demeter was feeling this way? What happened to all of the plants and crops on Earth? They all started dying because Demeter was not taking care of them. She was too upset about Persephone being gone. Why did Zeus try to persuade Hades to give Persephone back to Demeter? Right, there was no food on the earth, so the people were starving, and they weren't able to offer sacrifices to the gods either. Hades eventually does return Persephone to her mother, but only for part of the year. Only for a part of the year. Why only part of the year? Right. It was a rule in the underworld that if someone ate something from the underworld, they had to stay there forever. And Persephone had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds. So she had to stay with Hades for 6 months of the year, and then she could live with her mother Demeter for the other 6 months. Alright, let's take a look at our chart. We know the title of our myth and who our characters were. What did this myth try to explain? Did this myth explain anything in nature? You've got it. This myth explained the changing of the seasons. It explained why the seasons change. Remember, for those 6 months that Persephone is not with Demeter, Demeter is so sad and cannot take care of all of the plants on Earth. So it's winter because everything is dying. But when Persephone returns to her, it makes her so happy and fills her with so much light and warmth that it's summer again. Alright, my friends, go ahead and open up the PDF that's attached to this assignment, and I will show you what to do on that one. Alright, that assignment should look like this when you've opened it in Kami. This will be another journal entry about the characters of today's read aloud. Our main characters today, the title of our read aloud today was Demeter and Persephone. For today's assignment, you are going to write 2 or 3 sentences about one of the characters from today's read aloud. You could choose the character Demeter or the character Persephone. As you're writing about this character, think, what does the character do in the myth that we read? What did the character do? Why was this character important to the ancient Greeks? And what natural event does this myth explain? What does our myth explain? When you have written 2 or 3 sentences about the myth and the character that you have chosen, in the box above, go ahead and illustrate your myth. When you are done with that, go ahead and turn this journal entry in for today, and you are all finished with knowledge.